There's never going to be more than 21 million of this thing. There's an infinity of everything else. They're always making more of everything else. But this one thing, there's never going to be more than 21 million. Time preference is really a very fascinating concept. And for me, it is probably the one topic that you would benefit the most from learning about. Your money is not good at holding on to its value. Then you do not expect it to be there for you in the future. So therefore, the future is less and less certain for you.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Sovereign Health Podcast. My name is Andy Schoonover, and we're on a mission to inspire radical personal responsibility for both the financial and physical aspects of your health. We get the joy of hosting thought leaders who are reimagining how healthcare is delivered. Today I'm excited. We have one of my favorites, Saifedean Ammous, who is an author and economist. He's written some of the most impactful books on monetary policy over the last decade, the Bitcoin Standard, the Fiat Standard, and his newest book, which just came out over the last, maybe 30 or 60 days, The Principles of Economics. We are excited to talk to him about monetary policy. What does fiat mean, and how can Bitcoin change healthcare? We're excited to have Saifedean Ammous. Saifedean Ammous, thanks for joining the pod. Appreciate it. We're honored to have you. As I said in my intro, you're one of my favorites, and so we're excited to have you for the next hour. So thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me, man. Always a pleasure to be chatting to you.
Yeah. Well, I joke a little bit that your three books, which I'm a huge fan of, probably the best trilogy since Star Wars from my perspective. So incredible. I have to ask, three, when I want to go through which each one of these are. Bitcoin Standard, which many have referred to as the Bible of Bitcoin. Probably the most influential book on Bitcoin ever written. So incredible. I want to get into it more. I went on vacation a few weeks ago with my wife for our anniversary, and I brought that to the pool, and I think I've read it. I don't know how many times I've read it now, but always get some cool insights. Then the second up, which is actually one of my faves too, the Fiat Standard. I want to talk about this stuff. It's like, how does our screwed up monetary policy impact almost every facet of our lives? And then the newest one, which we gave out to our Crowd Health members, I think a couple hundred copies or so, Principles of Economics. So awesome trilogy here. Saif, for all the people who don't know about Bitcoin or have only heard of Bitcoin through kind of the filter of mainstream media, what is your elevator pitch to people to say, hey, this is legitimate, it's real, and it's necessary?
First of all, thank you so much for having me and for all of your kind words. I really appreciate it, sir. Thank you so much. My elevator pitch for Bitcoin, it depends on how long of an elevator ride it is. So whether you're in a skyscraper or in a short building. But, the kind of 30-second pitch would be, there's never going to be more than 21 million of this thing. And that's just the key idea that you want to communicate. But look, there's an infinity of everything else. They're always making more of everything else. But this one thing, there's never going to be more than 21 million. And it's not something that anybody can change. Nobody can change that. Nobody can go and just decide that they're going to be able to make more Bitcoin. And I can't explain to you in an elevator how and why that is the case. But I think it's something well worth looking into, because it's not just something that is optional for people who are interested in technology or people who are nerds about monetary history. It's important because everybody is suffering from the problem of inflation. And if you don't think you're suffering from inflation, doesn't mean that you aren't. You're just not aware of how much it screws the world around you. And the root of that problem is the fact that your money is continuously getting devalued because they keep making more of it. Well, here we've got a money that you can't make more of. And you can look into it and see why it's a very serious software project and not just a silly fad.
And so the bottom line here, it feels like to me, is governments, the United States government, the governments all over the world. We're seeing inflationary rates of 50, 70, 100%, just depending upon, in Zimbabwe, I remember back in the day, when I went there in college, I had to have a garbage bag, full of or whatever their Zimbabwean money was, because the inflation was, I think, thousands of percent at the time. And in essence, what you're saying is that is a product of governments not having prudent fiscal policies, and therefore have to print new money. More money supply goes in. There's more money to buy the same amount of goods, and therefore those goods, prices of those goods increase, right? I mean, that's the ultimate. I know that's very simplistic, but that's the ultimate problem here, is that we have governments that can't live the way that you and I have to live, which is, I get a certain amount of income every month. I can only spend that amount of income every month. And if I spend more than that amount, I have to take on debt. Eventually that debt runs out. Nobody's going to lend me any more money, and game over. I have to do bankruptcy. Well, the United States government and other governments don't follow that same policy. Am I close?
Yes, to an extent. I mean, they ultimately still follow it. It's just that they're afforded a very exorbitant detour along the way, where, I mean, eventually they will hit bankruptcy. There's no escaping the consequences of profligacy and waste. You will eventually get to the point where you do hit bankruptcy. But the difference is that when they have the ability to create your money out of thin air, then they'll take the scenic route, effectively, of destroying your wealth first before they get to declare bankruptcy. So when everybody uses the money that the government cannot make, which is the case when money was gold or silver or whatever else has been used as money throughout history, then they can continue to spend money on wars or on welfare or on enriching themselves or building palaces for themselves for as long as they have their own money, and they need to acquire money from others, and that's not cheap. It's not easy. And it makes you unpopular as a political leader if you go and you ask people for money. People don't like to hand over their money. And so inflation just allows them the incredible hack of taking your money without you having to hand it over, by just simply making more of that money and devaluing the value of the money that is in your pocket. And so what that means is, this is what really World War I brought to us, because that was the shift to this model of central banking around World War I, and the rationale was to finance government spending. And so the result is now that governments can just take on debt, and then when they can't pay off the debt, they can start literally printing money. And now, they figuratively print money, which is the digital way of making the money, because most money is digital in the fiat system. And so from that, they can continue to spend for as long as anybody in their jurisdiction who uses their money to store wealth in it is still using it. Then they have wealth that they can devalue and essentially appropriate. So the more wealth people store in their money, the more they can take from it by inflation. And then, of course, that encourages them to keep printing more and more. And then eventually they destroy the currency, and then eventually they declare bankruptcy. So, yeah, they do get back to bankruptcy eventually. But as I said, they take the scenic route.
So, one of the things that you outline in Bitcoin Standard is, it seems that every form of monetary not backed by something of substance like gold has failed, right? Like the Romans, empire failed, and what was there? Were they the lira or whatever their monetary policy was? Like every single form of currency to date has failed. Even the British pound, I think, has been devalued by 70 or 80% over the last 60 or 70 years. I mean, this would lead me to believe that ultimately the dollar will fail, which then leads to the question of when. I mean, is there some leading indicators of these failures that say, yeah, the dollar is going to fail, and it probably will fail within the next X number of years. I'm putting you on the spot. I mean, if you had an over under, if you're a betting man and had an over under, when is the hen going to come home to roost?
That's a tough one to answer. I'm going to go with about 15 years.
Maybe 15 like or 50? 15. 15.
Yeah.
So we're sitting here at 2023, and so we're talking about 2038 is the over under for you in terms of when the dollar fails.
Yeah, but I mean, I gotta say, like, I've heard way too many obituaries for the dollar throughout my life.
Sure.
I'm not particularly bearish on the dollar. I'm bearish on all fiat currencies being basically horrible, and all are circling the drain. However, I think the dollar is likely to be the last man standing. I think what we're going to be seeing, and what we have been seeing over the last few years, arguably the last few decades, is that the dollar is constantly getting devalued compared to real goods and services, but other national currencies are getting devalued even further. And I think this trend is going to continue more and more around the world as more people dump their local currencies for dollars, because dollars are more reliable than local currencies pretty much everywhere, almost everywhere, let's say. So more and more people are going to be going into the dollar. So I'm not particularly part of the kind of people that are going around saying, the end is nigh, it's going to blow up. And all this stuff about BRICS making an alternative currency that's backed by gold. I think that's all empty hype. None of that stuff's going to come to pass.
Sure.
It's a very big logistic problem, to try and have all these countries implement places where they can settle physical gold amongst themselves. It's going to be extremely expensive and time consuming to build these protocols for how they move gold around. They haven't even started discussing that stuff. They're just making press releases. So if they are going to start looking into doing something like this, it's going to be many, many, many years before they can come up with anything actionable. And if they do, I fully expect them to very quickly understand what they should be doing, which is realizing that basically Bitcoin offers them just the much more efficient way of doing this rather than moving physical gold around. So I still think, the vast majority of the world is still alien to Bitcoin, and they're still not sure how to use it and what to do with it. And they don't understand this idea of it as a monetary asset. And I think it's going to take time for people to understand this and for people to act upon it. So until then, I would say that the dollar remains basically the main winner of all of these global currency problems. Of course, I still think they're going to massively increase the supply of the dollar. They're going to hand out a lot of handouts, and they're going to bail out a lot of financial institutions. So there's still going to be inflation. So it's not like the dollar's going to do well. It's not going to be an excellent form of money, but I don't think it's going to be suffering too badly of inflation and devaluation compared to other currencies. So next to Bitcoin, it's going to do very badly. But it's going to be a while before Bitcoin grows to a point where it can replace the dollar. I guess this is my diplomatic way of trying to hedge around my number.
So I won't hold you to the 15-year over under, but do you feel like Bitcoin has similar timing? Is it still a 15-year, or do you think this is going to be a 2, 3, 4 decade transition from the dollar to Bitcoin?
I honestly don't know. I have no good reason to believe one of these or the other. I don't have very strong opinions about the future. I think we're headed in that direction, but I can't really make time frame.
Yeah.
predictions. I'd say, I mean, it takes time for people to learn it. Maybe people that are older than 50, 60, maybe they're just never going to make it into Bitcoin world. Maybe even people who are older than 40, which, would be awkward for me. But people in this kind of general age group, maybe we're just not meant to make it there. So maybe it's going to take time for, younger generations to grow up and pick up the majority of money and move it around into the digital realm. So it's honestly difficult.
It's hard.
I don't know, but again, the thing that I always say is that ultimately for you, this is an individual thing. So for me, it doesn't really matter when the rest of the world catches on. My Bitcoin is working fine as it is.
Mm-hmm.
So I just I keep my Bitcoin. I can take care of it and not have to worry about what the rest of the world is doing, because ultimately, Bitcoin already works as it is. It's already inflation resistant. Nobody can make more. There's nobody out there devaluing it. And over the long run, it works out as an infinitely better store of value than fiat money, or most of the things that you can do to store fiat money. All of the fiat saving mechanisms that people use, like bonds or stocks or real estate or all of these things, ultimately they don't do as well as just holding Bitcoin in the long term.
Yeah. Do you feel like there needs for Bitcoin to reach wider adoption? Do you feel like there needs to be more use cases for Bitcoin? I think that the hit on Bitcoin right now is you can hold it, don't sell your Bitcoin. Michael Saylor gets up on, stage and says, don't sell your Bitcoin. Others are trying to, like us and Oshi and other kind of companies are saying, hey, but we want to use Bitcoin. So there's a circular economy here of Bitcoin that in itself will create, wider spread adoption and maybe expedite the transition from the dollar to Bitcoin. Do you think that's important, or are we wasting our time?
No, I think it is important, but I think my honest opinion is that what really matters in order to be able to build a Bitcoin-based economy, in order for more and more people to transact with Bitcoin and for more economic activity to take place around Bitcoin, is that Bitcoin needs to become more, and it needs to become a bigger part of people's cash balances. This is what it ultimately comes down to. And so, if you don't have Bitcoin in your cash balance, but you're going through Bitcoin rituals in order to use Bitcoin in order to encourage adoption, you're just incurring a lot of transaction costs, but you're not really moving the needle on the score line that actually matters. You're not really actually scoring the goals that count. So if you had your cash balances in Bitcoin, then naturally you'd be the sort of person who would be willing to transact with Bitcoin because you have a large cash balance in Bitcoin. So if you're getting paid for something, or if you're making a payment for something, you would be willing to consider Bitcoin as something to do, to conduct this payment with. But in order to get there, of course, a majority of your cash balance needs to be in Bitcoin. So we need to, in order for Bitcoin to truly be money, it needs to win on that metric. That's the real deal. On the other hand, if you don't have that cash balance, then let's say you're going to have some kind of Bitcoin payment solution, something like a Bitcoin-based debit card. So you could spend Bitcoin. So then you'd buy Bitcoin, convert it to buy Bitcoin, and then make the payment in Bitcoin. But you'd be buying it from fiat, so you'd be converting the fiat to Bitcoin, paying an transaction fee. And then you'd be paying the Bitcoin transaction fee to send it to the person you're buying things from. And then they'd be, if they don't have a Bitcoin balance as well, and they're just doing this for the transaction, then they don't keep the cash in Bitcoin, then they're going to be selling it for fiat as well. And so at the end of the day, both of you go home with a fiat cash balance. In that case, it's kind of performative in a sense that it doesn't really make much of a difference, to be honest. I think what would make more difference is if you and that merchant saved these extra Satoshis that you wasted on transaction fees and instead stack sats with them and just increase the size of your cash balance in Bitcoin. Because then if you have a large cash balance in Bitcoin, then when you're going to be transacting with somebody, you're not going to be incurring this ridiculous opportunity cost and slippage of converting in and out of fiat twice in order to conduct the transaction if you don't have the cash balances. So you want to build your cash balances so that you become more likely to engage in this trade, and you want more and more people to do this. So personally, for me, on my website, I sell my courses and my books. Since I know a big chunk of my audience are Bitcoiners, so I do accept Bitcoin. And the people that work for me in the website, I pay them in Bitcoin as well. So this works out fine for me because, I have a cash balance in Bitcoin, and most of these people that are buying from me and working for me are also Bitcoiners. Mm-hmm. So this is how it emerges, I think. So in that sense, I think, what Crowd Health is doing is that ultimately you guys are holding on to cash balances in your customers' accounts. And that's what really counts. So you're helping people stack more and more Bitcoin, which is kind of the secret ingredient. I mean, sure. That and the negotiating with the
I think I think I would hold a bigger Bitcoin cash balance if I had more opportunities to use it. You see what I'm saying? Like if I could use it for my big expenses, or the big expenses of a normal person, right, is your mortgage is probably number one. Your, healthcare might be up there. Your groceries are going to be up there. Those types of things. If I can start using Bitcoin to buy those things or to pay for those things, then I probably would hold a bigger Bitcoin balance. And so, the way that I think about that is if we can start giving you the opportunity to pay for your healthcare in Bitcoin, that then will raise the amount of Bitcoin cash that you will hold on to as opposed to keeping it in fiat. And so, I think you see these arguments on Twitter around just stack sats and don't worry about using them. I'm trying to say, stack sats, just like saving is a good thing, but also let's create some circularity here so that I can actually start using my sats. And as a result of that, I will stack more sats so that I can use that, right? So it's not a distributive kind of relationship there. It's more just I want to increase my cash supply of sats so that I can actually go and use them. So I was just curious about your perspective on that. One of the things that you talk about in the Bitcoin Standard that I wasn't familiar with before reading it. I'm not an economist, so you'll have to excuse me for this, but it's load time preference versus high time preference. I think it's and going back to my previous story about me reading this while I was sitting on the beach with my wife at our vacation, we sat there arguing whether our 4-year-old and our 6-year-old would take the marshmallow now or would they wait for the 2 marshmallows later. So how does load time preference and high time preference fit into this? And then I have to ask you, would your kids take the marshmallow now versus the 2 marshmallows later?
My kids will not take any marshmallows. That's
there you go. They're not even going to be offered a marshmallow option.
Yeah, well, to be fair, they did get marshmallows a few weeks ago. So, I mean, but yeah, no, I did not think this doing the test with them because, I guess I just don't want them to have more. I don't have the opportunity of doing it. Well, time preference is really a very fascinating concept. And for me, it is probably the one topic that you would benefit the most from learning about in all of economics, in terms of the impact that it has on you as an individual, because it helps you understand how your decisions are important across time. And once you understand the temporal aspect of your decision making, I believe it's a very powerful tool in helping you make better decisions and helping you stick to those decisions. So I know that since I started learning about this, the implication for me individually was absolutely powerful in terms of just how it transforms the way you think, the way you approach problems, the way you try and tackle them. And the key idea is you have this inner calculus that is taking place inside you all day, every day, at all times, where you are weighing the present against the future. You are weighing what you have right now versus the future. And at all points in time, you can sacrifice the future to benefit the present. So at any point in time, you can, you can decide, you know what, I could sell my house, and I'll take all of that money and throw an amazing party this weekend. That's always a possibility. Everybody who has a house is living with that possibility at every day that, you could sell that house and throw the most amazing party you've ever been to this weekend. And then, you won't have a house for the rest of your life, but, you will have had a great weekend. So that kind of trade-off is everywhere. And this is kind of an extreme example, but also it's in your food, when you're deciding whether you should eat the thing that is good for you today, that feels great today because you feel like it, because you're part of a group of sugar junkies that are pushing it on you, and you want to fit in. And so, you gain the happiness of enjoying this thing today, but then you pay the cost in that you're going to feel like crap the next day. You're going to be slower at the gym, and you're going to not feel as good as you do into the future. And it's going to maybe exacerbate your weight problem and could lead to other more serious health complications down the line. So you're also constantly doing that trade-off. You're doing it with money decisions. Should I save or should I spend? Should I just consume the money that I have right now and enjoy it? Or should I keep some for the future? These are questions that everybody's almost always going through. And understanding that your differing valuation of the future versus the present is what is constantly driving most of those decisions. And if you just become conscious of that aspect of it, I believe it's extremely powerful in helping you move these choices in a way that is more productive and constructive for you in the long run. So once you understand this complexity, or once you understand this trade-off that exists, it becomes, I believe it becomes much easier to understand the true nature of the choice that you're facing. So once you realize that, look, it's not just that you are really craving this sweet, sugary thing right now, you have to understand that there's another force there. So this is the trade-off. Am I going to enjoy it right now, or do I want to and suffer the consequences later? Or am I going to enjoy not having to suffer the consequences? Once you understand these things, I believe it becomes much more manageable, perhaps, to optimize for making the correct decisions over the long term.
So just to clarify, so high time preference is you want to be gratified now. You're going to face the consequences later. Low time preference is I'm going to delay gratification, knowing that the value of whatever I delay gets greater with time. And so I'm consistently choosing to delay gratification. And we see this in all types of places, which is, with our money, do we spend it now? Do we save it? With our food, do we eat it now? Do we not eat it? Knowing that if we eat it now, the crap now, it might feel good in the short term, but in the long term, it has a devastating impact on our bodies. I think, Saif, the question I have, and I think this might be a behavioral economics question, but I'm not sure. There is such a dramatic impact on what we eat to how we are going to live our lives in our 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Yet, the vast majority of the American public are considered overweight. I think it's 70% of the American public is overweight. We continue to make really bad decisions. As a result of that, we spend twice as much on healthcare as anybody else. We have chronic conditions. And those, to make it more maybe tactical or, logical here, it's, we can't, the benefit or the ability for us to interact with our kids and our grandkids and all these things, like it seems so huge to me, like the consequence seems so big, yet we still eat it like crap. We still have a high time preference for food. Why do you feel like that is?
Yeah, so in my book, The Fiat Standard, I've got a whole chapter on fiat food. And I make the case that it wasn't just a coincidence that the century of fiat money saw the human diet devolve into garbage, essentially.
Can you define fiat real quick, Saif, just so with people who aren't familiar with that? Us Bitcoiners, we love talking about fiat. Just, the car company got upset because we all talk about their cars being, bad. So what does fiat mean?
Yeah, fiat is the Latin word that means by decree. So something is made fiat by decree. And it's the term that is used for fiat money because it's government money by decree. But I'm proud to say I've helped popularize the term beyond just that narrow implication. And so the book, The Fiat Standard, contains a lot of chapters that talk about fiat, fiat food, fiat science, fiat architecture, fiat time preference, fiat, all kinds of aspects of life when viewed through the lens of fiat, I believe offer very revealing lessons. So the overarching the overarching idea here is, if you think about, in this book, I study fiat from a technical perspective. How does fiat money work? And the key concept, perhaps the key analytical concept, is that in fiat money, new money is made when debt is created. So whenever new debt is created by a financial institution that's backed by the Federal Reserve, that creates new money. So that's the starting point. And so then you see why the world is run on debt and why everybody goes toward debt effectively. Because every time you get into debt, new money is being created. And so it's effectively like mining Bitcoin or mining gold. Mining fiat is done by issuing debt. And so with that implication, you see that you have the government and the banking system benefiting from the issuing of money and issuing of debt. And so they're constantly encouraging it. And that's leading to more and more money creation, which is leading to an increase in the supply of money and a decline in the value of money. And so that hits people's savings, ruins people's ability to save, and encourages people to get into debt. So the value of the currency is declining. People stop saving, people get into debt. And so that world in which essentially government is financing itself through destroying the currency and through destroying people's ability to save for their future creates a massive imbalance in society, wherein people now can't provide for themselves because their wealth is being sucked out of their hands thanks to the money printer, whereas government can't provide for itself and for them as well, and for everybody, because it has a magic money printer. It's not physically printing money, but it's figuratively. We have magical figurative printer of money that is constantly making new money, allowing the government to spend it whenever it wants. And so more and more of life becomes decided by government, and more of life becomes determined effectively by fiat. And so the driving force is, on the one hand, you're taking away the savings from people and you're adding the wealth to governments, so allowing governments to spend, and therefore giving their fiat a lot of power and authority to be able to determine what is what in the world. And then on the other side, the flip side of this coin is that, well, now governments have so much money, they also have the ability to influence what you think. And the one very important thing they need to influence is they need to hide from you the fact that you are getting robbed. And so they need pretty good propaganda to try and convince you that, listen, things are fine and you're not getting poorer. And one of the ways in which they have done this propaganda, I believe, is the popularization of these cheap industrial products as an alternative to food, real food, which humans used to eat. And the reason that they do this is because these things are cheaper to produce in scale. And so therefore you can cover up inflation. You can tell people, look, as long as you eat cheap garbage, we're not going to call it cheap garbage. We're going to tell you this is a healthy, balanced diet. We're going to tell you that it's good for you. We're going to tell you that this is Harvard approved. This is the Mediterranean diet. This is all the good stuff that you need to do. But then um, if you eat this, the cost is going to be lower, so it's not going to look like you're getting poorer from all of the inflation. So on the one hand, people are getting poorer, and so they're unable to afford food. On the other hand, they're being told by the people that are taking their wealth through inflation that, hey, no, food's actually bad for you. Meat is going to give you colon cancer, and meat is also going to ruin the weather because apparently cows fart. And, this entire planet is in such an intricate balance that a few cows farting is going to throw everything out of whack. And so, eating meat is obviously bad for you. And the alternatives are all these heavily industrially processed garbage, which is produced at scale, highly profitable, shelf stable, optimized for being turned into highly addictive packaged goods, which people get addicted to. And you're being told that is actually better for you, that's actually what food should be. And so this, I believe, is the underlying driver of most health problems. I mean, there's an enormous number of people who have effectively woken up from this and have realized, I don't want to be living like this. I want to eat properly. And they've started eating properly and they've stopped eating like this. And they have, they all report an enormous improvement in their health. Like you see this in low carb groups and in carnivore groups and keto groups, enormous increases in health. Even among people who witness improvements through going through something like a vegan or vegetarian diet, it always comes from the reduction of the consumption of highly processed foods, which I like to call fiat foods, things that were invented in the 20th century, and governments have subsidized them, and they've told you that they're good for you, and they keep telling you to eat them, and they feed them to your kids at school, and they feed them to people in all kinds of situations. And they're just not good for you. They are absolutely terrible for you.
So do you think this is less kind of time preference and more ignorance, or do you think it's a combination of both? Because if this is the government basically subsidizing food that's bad for us, that's going to make us fat, yet and the government then tells us that it's okay for us. I mean, we have this food pyramid that's been around for 40 or 50 years now that shows, grains and all this processed crap at the bottom of that pyramid, meaning it's the base. It's where we should get most of our calories. That's what the government is telling us. And so can we plead ignorance here? Or do you think it truly is people are self-gratifying now as opposed to waiting and getting the benefits of good health later? Which is it? Or is it a mix?
Yeah. No, absolutely. I should have added the point on time preference. I skipped that one. But yeah, so there's the aspect that you have less money to afford the food. They have the money to tell you that you should eat cheap garbage. But also, I think the other aspect, which I discuss as well, is the fact that when your money is not good at holding on to its value, then you do not expect it to be there for you in the future. So therefore, the future is less and less certain for you. In other words, I think of the quality of your money as being like a control knob for your time preference. And you see this in places where there's hyperinflation. In places where there's hyperinflation, nobody thinks of the long term. People are just thinking about their day-to-day survival because they have a huge uncertainty surrounding their day-to-day survival. And there's huge uncertainty surrounding the future because the future is very uncertain. It's very far. And it's not very easy to predict what's going to happen in the future because you can't provide for yourself in the future. There's no easy, convenient mechanism with which you can save so that you know where you're going to be in the future. So then the future becomes less certain, becomes less hazy, more hazy, less certain. And so you're less likely to think about it. You're less likely to provide for it. And so your decision-making is likely to become more and more present-oriented. In other words, you have a high time preference. You discount the future heavily, and you prioritize the current time much more heavily. So I think this kind of situation, I argued this extensively in the Fiat Standard and in my new third book in Principles of Economics, that money is enormously important toward determining time preferences. So when we live in inflationary societies, what you see is a slow motion play of what happens to people's time preference under a hyperinflationary scenario, wherein people lose trust in the future, lose faith in the future, lose the ability to provide for the future. And so everything becomes more short-termist. And this is reflected in diet choices, I think. It's also reflected in personal morality and behavior and civility, in the way in which people behave with one another, in the way in which people respect themselves and their friendships. Essentially, civilized behavior is how we teach ourselves to get over our inner animal basic instincts and do the things that improve our lives and well-being into the long term. And when you destroy money, you destroy regard for the long term, you destroy civilized behavior, you witness societal collapse. And I think it's sad to say this, but you see this happening most of the world these days, that because of inflation, I mean, people have normalized a lot of those things, but they shouldn't be normalized. The notion that crime is spreading so much, I don't think that can be separated from the fact that time preference is rising.
You know, we were joking earlier about the marshmallow experiment, and so just to give the audience a little bit of background there, you talk about it in your book, but there was an experiment back in the 1960s, I believe, at Stanford, where they put kids in a room, put one marshmallow in front of them and said, hey, you can eat this one marshmallow now, or you can wait 15 minutes and I'll come back and I'll give you 2 marshmallows. And they just, evaluated whether the kids took it now or later. And that's why I was referencing time preference. The kids with the high time preference are the ones who would take it right now. The kids with the lower, or at least the lower time preference, if kids can really have low time preference, but to the extent they can, they will wait for those two marshmallows. And there's a follow-up to that study that came out in 2020 that's found a lot of the kids that took the marshmallow right away actually did come from environments in which they weren't sure what the next day was going to bring. So the kids who were of the lower socioeconomic scale were much more likely to be high time preference. We're much more likely to take that marshmallow now as opposed to later, which makes sense, which is what you're talking about. If my money is going to be worth 0 in, a year or 2 years or 3 years, I'm much more likely to spend it now because it's going to be worth a lot less later. With these kids, what they were saying is look, if you have food in front of you, you eat it, because that food may not show up for dinner or breakfast or lunch or dinner tomorrow. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting component of that. But it's, as my wife and I are arguing whether our kids are going to take this marshmallow, it did bring up the conversation that I'd love to talk to you about, which is, how do we train our kids, or can we train our kids to be low time preference? And as I've gotten to know you over the last year, I know that there's probably only one thing you're more passionate about than, economics, and that is your family. And so I was just curious, from your perspective, how do you think about raising kids to be low time preference kids? Because that study showed the kids who are low time preference end up having much more fulfilling lives. They do better. They're much more hopeful. They're much more grateful for what they have. How do you bring up kids that are, low time preference? If you don't mind me asking too personal of a question.
No, that's a great question. Honestly, this is something that I have focused a lot on with my upbringing of my children. It sometimes occurs to me that basically this is what your job is as a parent. You just got to lower their time preference enough for them to be able to stand on their own feet in the world and get to the point where they have a vision of their future. They can take on the world and not get distracted by shiny objects along the way that compromise their long-term future. This is really what it comes down to. And I mean, ultimately, they're going to pick things to do in life that you're not going to have a lot of power to influence. So who knows? Maybe I mean, you can teach them, you can take them in all kinds of directions, but you have very limited control. You can't control them, so that they could. You could decide you want your kid to be a doctor, you want them to be an engineer, but then they could go in any kind of direction. So all of the kind of education that you try to put into them that could lead them in one of those things might effectively not be very useful. But the one thing that is going to be useful for them, no matter what, is learning to prioritize the long term, lowering their time preference as much as possible, thinking of the long term, because it's going to matter to their health. It's going to matter to their own personal relationships, to their marriages, to their ability to interact with people at work, with their own family, with everything. It's a prerequisite for civilized life to have a lower time preference. And if you don't manage it, you are just going to continue to pay the consequences throughout the rest of your life. So it's a very, very pivotal thing to teach children. I don't happen to have any kind of detailed plan, unfortunately, to sell about this, but it's I mean, there's no detailed plan. Also, there's no easy kind of tick these boxes and then you'll teach them low time preference. I mean, if anybody listening has one, please do share it with me. I've been very curious about trying to learn ways in which you could do this. But what I have done is to just try and first of all, I think the key thing is to consciously stipulate this idea and explain it to them and make them aware of it. I think this is really awareness is half the battle won almost. It's true when you just communicate the idea of time preference. People don't need to spend hours reading economic theory to understand what time preference is, but simply getting that sense of understanding what is meant by the concept of thinking about the short term versus the long term, how you could benefit enormously from prioritizing the short term less and less, and by increasing your prioritization of the long term. That is a very important concept. And so, you're going to definitely get plenty of chances to illustrate this with your children. There's plenty of times. I mean, that's really what your job is as a parent. You think about it, pretty much everything. If you left it up to them, if you let them decide what they want to do, they want to run into traffic. They want to eat candy all day, every day. They're constantly doing things that are going to get them into trouble. And all you have to do is just, anytime you need to tell them, no, you can't do this. You can't run into traffic. You can't sit in the car without getting buckled in your car seat. Every one of those times, that's an opportunity to explain this concept to them, because the reason you're doing it is, you're sacrificing immediate short-term enjoyment because you don't want to suffer the consequences in the long term. So I think that this was the first lesson that I communicated to my daughter when she was 3, maybe even 2 or something like that, between the age of 2 or 3, where she was saying, I don't want to sit in the car seat. And I explained to her why even though we don't enjoy the car seat, we don't like to be buckled into the car and be more fun, it's better to be buckled now and then not have to spend the rest of your life worrying and suffering from the consequences of something bad happening. And I mean, I've generally just been astonished at how easy it is to communicate complex ideas to children if you just explain them plainly and with respect. You don't talk down to them, you don't baby talk to them, you just tell them, well, I just followed the train of thought with her that, what would happen if we unbuckled you? Well, then something happens in the car, you'll move around, you could bump your head, you could get hurt. So what do? We choose to suffer the seatbelt, because even though it's not fun now, we don't want to suffer the other thing later, which is much worse. And then I specifically articulated to her that this is called low time preference. So then we just stuck with the idea that, we're constantly explaining the idea of low time preference. We're doing this because it's a low time preference thing, and we're low time preference people. We'd like to do things that are low time preference. And so then again, you never run out of ways of explaining that. And I try and always bring it back to this, and then just, um, I mean, establish it in her at a very young age that this is just how we are. We are low time preference. So given the choice between we enjoy something right now that hurts us in the future, we choose not to. Mm-hmm. And so anytime that, she's trying to do something that's dangerous, or something that's, she wants to eat some junk food or something like that, I'm always using that argument that, if you eat it right now, you might enjoy it today, but then tomorrow you're going to wake up with not feeling too well, and then your teeth might rot, and then you might have health problems later on. Yeah. And the good thing is, so what we do with food, for instance, is at home, we don't bring in any junk at home. That they eat mostly meat, and they have occasionally they'll have some they have some fruits, and they have some. Vegetables, or sometimes some grains even, but not a lot. But they don't have any processed foods, and they don't have processed sugar. But when they go out, they'll, when they're at a birthday, we don't like to be helicoptering on top of them and just telling them, eat this, don't eat that. So what I do usually is I just feed them very well at home. So whenever we're going out somewhere, we feed them with meat before we go. And then if you feed them with meat, that's it. You're fighting the war on winning terrain. You're fighting on the enemy's territory. They're already full, and so they go to the birthday. They see all these amazing candies. They'll be curious. They want to try it. They see all these amazing colors. They try it, but they can't have too much because they're well fed and because they're not used to it. These things are drugs. And they're highly addictive drugs, and you need to work up an appetite. Like you can't just take somebody who's never had a drug and expect them to consume large quantities. It's going to hit them very quickly. So they take small quantities, and then they just get on with their day. They enjoy themselves. They enjoy the birthday. They don't spend a lot of time eating. But then that's where the time preference lesson comes in, is because this is not common for them, they'll feel it. So late in the afternoon, they'll feel something is weird because they have all these colorings and all these awful junk in them. And that's where, I don't miss the chance to rub it in and to teach them the lesson. Is to see, you chose to eat this stuff. Now you have to suffer from this. And usually it's the same day, and then the next day they're not feeling too good from it. And they get it. And so now it's not really an issue for us with food. Like we don't have to try too hard to stop her, because we just remind her, it doesn't. Remember what happens. You're not going to feel too well after you try this, and she'll get it. And so I think just simply portraying this trade-off between the short term and the long term is it makes it much easier to deal with them, because it activates their intelligence. Like they think about it, and it's respectful of them, and it makes them feel important, and it makes them feel mature, that they're able to process this and understand it, and it's a way for them to grow, literally.
Yeah. No, and if I may, one of the things I've seen with you, again, getting to know you over the last year or so, is you're intentional with your kids about showing them what is truth. If kids don't understand what is truth, then they won't know that eating candy is bad for them, or smoking cigarettes is bad for them, or spending all of the, selling your house and having a big party is bad for them ultimately. And so it feels to me like some of the decisions you've made in your life is, you're going to show your kids and keep them in cultures that show your kids what truth actually is. And I think that's a huge component of this, especially kind of with the American culture that we all live in, which they're telling you meat is bad, sun is bad, all of these things that are good are actually bad. We have to get down. We have to distill it down and say, okay, what is the ultimate truth here? And I think that's an important part of, what you're about, at least from what I've learned from you over the last year or so of getting to know you. one of the things I've kind of started looking at is there's a professor, his name is Rick Snyder. I think he's actually passed away now, but he's got a theory called hope theory, which is kind of comprised of three different components. One is, giving, you got to have goals. To have some hope, you have to have a goal. You have to have something that you're firing at. Then the second component of that is you have to have realistic ways of getting to that goal. And then the third component of that is you have to persevere along the way, knowing that there's going to be barriers in that pathway. And so as I think about my kids, I want them to have goals, whether it be, big goals like being president of the United States or little goals like getting their room, cleaned up. Okay, let's now develop pathways. Let's help them develop pathways to get there. And then let's show them what it looks like to fail, stand back up again, and continue on. Because if you're going to lay down and die the first time that you fail, then you're not going to make it very far, right? And so that's the way that I kind of think about, building this into my kids is allowing them to go through kind of those three kind of components of what ultimately provides hope. If you have a goal, if you know how to get there, and you're willing to stand back up again, those to me is, leads to a low time preference approach to life. So, man, this is
very good. Yeah.
This has been fun. Again, Saif has got amazing books out there. You can find them pretty much anywhere. Go to his website. What's your website? It's just saifedean.com, correct? Mm-hmm. Saifedean.com. Yes. If you have not read this book, this is a must. The Bitcoin Standard. Again, it's if you're skeptical of Bitcoin, read this. You can read this in probably a half a dozen sittings. It doesn't take too long. And the examples in this book go all the way from the U.S. economy to little miniature economies in remote Pacific islands. I think that one that was a Pacific island, right? Like I forget exactly what the island was called, but like how currencies fail for very a number of reasons. But I read this. I was, as we call it in the Bitcoin community, orange pilled. Between Saif and Jimmy Song, who I know Saif well, those two, through their writing and through their words, orange pilled me. So I'm appreciative of that. Second one is the fiat standard. It's how does this government takeover of our monetary system impact pretty much everything in our everyday lives, from our healthcare to our food to our oil to our technology, everything. And then the last one here is principles of economics. It's kind of a textbook, but it doesn't read like a textbook. It is Austrian economics, which again, before Bitcoin, I had no idea what that was. I was trained on Keynesian economics, which I think the vast majority of our university system, is trained on, which is absolute garbage. So go out and read that too. Saif, I really appreciate it, man. Thanks for taking the time to hang out with us for a little bit.
Thank you so much for having me, Andy. I should add, thank you so much for all of your kind words, but I'm also a huge fan of what you guys are doing in Crowd Health. I really think it's absolutely amazing that you're managing to pull that off. And it's a very Bitcoiner thing to do, because there are so many people out there that are going out every day and beating the drum of how corrupt the medical system is, and yet very few people are able to come up with such a good actionable solution, which is, let's give people an alternative that works and connect doctors directly with patients and make things a lot cheaper and a lot more productive for everybody involved. So kudos to you guys. Good job.
I appreciate it. Honestly, it's a lot of it inspired by you and this kind of low time preference framework that you put out there, because things, I know that our culture tells us that we want things now, but big long-term impact requires time. It requires waiting. It might require a decade or 2 decades for us to do with the healthcare system, what you all are trying to do and us Bitcoiners are trying to do with the monetary system. And so it's just, I hope if anybody comes away from this talk, it's to look into what low time preference mean, do some work on it, buy Bitcoin Standard, because I do believe that a low time preference lifestyle is the key to joy. And so, Saif, thanks again. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, man. Thank you so much. Take care.
Bye.